This is Echo Greenfield's first experience with revisionist history because of technical difficulties. We have lost the original video of our session on July 7th on oral history. So we are recreating some high points of it using a Zoom meeting on September 17th. Margo Shea and Lindy Whiton are the presenters. And so again, thank you for being willing to recreate this session with us.
Good morning, everybody, and hi. It's good to see you. When I got invited by Lindy to talk with you all and with the extended community of history makers and history lovers in Greenfield and the region, I was really struck by this thing that you had on your website. And it may have been Doug that said it. I think it was that we are surrounded and influenced by histories in plain sight. And we are surrounded and influenced by histories that have disappeared from our sight. And we are wealthy in history. And I was so struck by that for a lot of different reasons. I was struck by the sense of place. I was struck by the sense of mission, that it is our responsibility and it is part of the way we express our civic and social commitments to our place and to each other by not only paying attention to what has happened in the past that's sort of still present in our stories and in our landscapes, but also holding space and making time for discovering histories that have either gone unnoticed or have been erased, or for whatever reason are no longer kind of a currency or something that we move with as we're exploring our own identities and our own sense of the place, the present, and the future. And I think that, we live in a capitalist society, and this idea of wealth and the idea of resources is so often kind of transactionalized, right? It's sort of simple, what do you give? What do you get? And this idea that we're wealthy in history really sort of turns that on its head, because it reminds us that our resources and our wealth are something we hold in common. There's something that we share, and there's something that we build. And so I was so excited to be invited to sort of participate in some small way in this project, and to share my experiences and to share some of the things about oral history specifically that matter a lot to me, and that I think are maybe useful and helpful to others who are embarking on this, or who maybe have done it before. And I know that's one of the things we talked about in a lot of different settings, in educational settings, in classroom settings, in community settings, within our families. We are all practitioners of oral history. We listen and we share, and we frame our experiences through our memories, which themselves are incredibly social. So the kind of the democratizing sense of oral history and the sense that we're all we can be better at it, but at a very fundamental level, we are already all practitioners, seems such an important thing to say in the context of the project that you all are working on.
Definitely.
So I know that I said, I told a story when I did the workshop about being involved with storytellers in Ireland and volunteering in the early 2000s for an international storytelling festival. And I was really captivated by these storytellers from all over the world. And they held me kind of in their voices and in their stories. And I remember after one storytelling session, a man from County Cork, with that sort of inimitable Cork accent, came up to me and said, "I just want to thank you. You're a mighty listener. You're a mighty listener." And I had never thought that listening, that actually sort of being in the moment of listening, really listening, is something that can be felt and really can be powerful, not just to the one who is listening, but also to those who are telling. And so for me, oral history at its most basic is a commitment to speaking and listening. And both of those roles are equally important. And in fact, it has been proven over and over and over again that the listener shapes the telling. That one listener with the exact same interview questions will get really different answers from another listener. And so central to this is listening and kind of figuring out what it means. We have to have our questions, and we also have to be prepared for conversations to go completely off the rails of what we thought was going to happen. And in a lot of ways, that's kind of the magic. So, one of the things that I think is important about oral history for people getting involved in it is that people tend to have very clear ideas about what constitutes history and what doesn't. And a lot of times people just don't really think of themselves as either actors or subjects in history, as real participants and contributors to the process of history making. And I think that oral history is a really important intervention in that kind of understanding of what history is, because it does two things. It makes all of us history makers and historians, and it also elevates and expands and complicates our sort of simplistic ideas of what counts as history. Right. And we all know so many people who just get turned off by history because they think it's names and dates of people that lived a long time ago that didn't really probably look anything like them or have experiences that they could relate to. And therefore, history itself has seemed like this, kind of out of touch and out of date inventory of stuff. And so, oral history is about listening and talking. It's also about making and holding space for the kinds of experiences and the kinds of relationships to place and to people, and relationships with place and with people that often really resonates at a local level. And local history is almost impossible to do without a commitment to oral history. So, I think that there are some basic things that are important for folks to pay attention to when they're doing oral history. And I'll talk about those in just a minute, but I just want to spend a couple of minutes sort of talking about oral history and memory. Right? Because I think that a lot of us were raised with this idea, and school certainly didn't help change this, but we were raised with the idea that the past is a filing cabinet and everything's in it. And in order to document the past, all you have to do is open up the filing cabinet and sort of pull stuff out. Right? And so maybe there's some difference and differentiation on what you grab and what order you put things in, but there's this sort of notion that it's all there. the reality is that we're all sort of holding on to and getting rid of um, events and ideas and thoughts and feelings in the moment, right? And the same thing works for memory. We hold on to and kind of gird our identities around particular memories in the context of what's happening to us in the moment. We remember things that sort of resonate with who we are today, and we forget things or repress things, if you use another language, things that don't seem very relevant and don't serve us and support our identities and the way we form our identities as individuals, in families, in groups, in communities. And so the really exciting thing about oral history is that it takes advantage of this notion that memory is a creative act, right? It's an act of invention almost as much as an act of retrieval. And historians have always sort of, clutched their pearls at that notion, right? It's so inaccurate, it's biased, it's subjective. And yet I would make the argument that much of our own understanding of reality in the present is also active, biased, and subjective, right? And so when we engage with oral history, we make a commitment to inviting and supporting a lot of different perspectives about the past. And we do that in ways that kind of encourage people to make some serious connections between their present and their past, right? And so that doesn't mean kind of just blithely accepting people's versions of the past that seem counter to reality, right? It doesn't mean that there is no truth and that everything is just a big circus and whoever's got the loudest loudspeaker wins, right? I don't believe that either. And yet I think that we need to sort of position oral history sort of in the middle, right, between an active engagement with people's understandings of themselves, their places, and the past, and a larger chronicle to which we are contributing all of this information. So I kind of think of oral history as a really fertile meeting ground between different conceptions of the past and the ways it impacts us in the present and for the future. So listening is really key, asking questions, trying to help people elucidate their values and their perceptions and their knowledge as part of the interview process. Thinking of the conversation as the kind of unit of analysis and engagement, as opposed to thinking of your interviewee or participant as a source, is really, really critical. And I think one of the things we also talked about is the way that people self-censor and the way that people kind of curate first-person narratives to display the best version of themselves or to present things in ways that may be simple and clear, right? And I think that oral history offers opportunities to bring fuller representations of individual and community experience to the table. And so we raise all these issues of time, of perspective, of self-identity, of identity of self within groups. And so I think that oral history at the same time, it's like it takes our individual experiences and our ways of knowing and being, and in some way clarifies and communicates that that is indeed part of the historical record. And at the same time, it invites people to do some work of self-reflection and some critical engagement with their own sense of past, especially in relationship to the present. And it is in that moment that I think we not only add complexity, important complexity to the historical record, but we also find a kind of space that engages the past in our own constructions of the present and the future. And, one of the things I noticed, I came to the talk about the energy park, and it was kind of a history of process. It was a history of process with the framing of this community space and all of the people and all of the partners and commitments and talents and resources that were brought to bear in order to create that public space. And there was so much about the present, and there was so much juxtaposition of the past and the present in that talk, because it was essentially kind of a work of memory, of individual memory, but also community memory. And one couldn't leave that talk without wondering and thinking, what resources, our resources are different now. The cast of characters is different, the players, the issues. But how do we kind of build on what is clearly a set of community values and that haven't gone away, right? We don't need to romanticize the past as the only time where those things can happen, right? They're still here, but they look different, and we look different. But you couldn't sort of go to that talk without wondering, how might we do that now in our time?
Right where we're sitting, right in the Lava Center.
Exactly. So I know one of the other things I talked about was sort of power in the relationship with the historical record. And I remember when I was at the Lava Center, I gave a talk about some of my own historical research, and I had talked about finding evidence of a place called Shamrock Hall in Derry, Northern Ireland. And I was like, I'm really curious about Shamrock Hall, and the head librarian of the city library was like, there was no such place. And she was so categorical. She was so sure. And I was like, yeah, but it was in the paper. And she just was like, no, it wasn't. And then I asked, she went to lunch, and I waited till she went to lunch. And then I asked another librarian, and she said, it was just a wee hut. It was just a wee tin corrugated hut. It wasn't much. You wouldn't want to know anything about that. It wasn't much. And I was like, okay, whatever. And then, a couple nights later, I was in a taxi, and I asked the taxi driver if he'd ever heard of Shamrock Hall. And he was like, oh, I can show you where it was. I learned how to box in Shamrock Hall. And that's where the IRA held their courts in 1920 during the troubles of 1920. And people were looting, and there was carry on and bother. And that's where they held their sort of local, their own, parallel version of justice. And all of this stuff came out in this taxi ride because taxi drivers know literally everything. That's just me that's a total tangent, and I'm sorry, you can cut it out of the video. But I really think that one of the things we lose with Uber and Lyft, besides basic things like any protection for workers and this collapse of gig economy, but we lose that knowledge. We lose that sense of place. We lose those eyes on the street. Taxi, Jane Jacobs is a huge influence of mine. And that concept of eyes on the street, it rang so true with taxi drivers in Derry and Belfast and other parts of Ireland. But I think that we all are very conscious today of how power exerts its hand on our understanding and interpretation of the past. And I think we also all understand today the ways in which citizen history, public history, oral history changes and complicates that for the good. And so that's something I just kind of wanted to say. But I also just wanted to talk about sort of the basics, right? Testing your recording equipment before you go, leaving your equipment on, for as long as possible, ideally until you walk out the door, exploring in informed consent, making sure that your participants know exactly why you're conducting oral history interviews, have a sense of what you are hoping to learn in those interviews. They should understand that they can stop the interview at any time, and that they will be asked either in that moment where they're being invited to provide their informed consent, or at a subsequent moment after the interview, to provide a deed of gift for you to take that interview and do what you will with it. And they should understand that they should have options, right? If they would like to be anonymized so that their name is not used, if they would like to see any products that are built using their interviews as a primary source before those things are made public. They should be allowed, if it's right for the project, to request that their interview comes back to them in full and isn't used. There's lots of ways that you can work, and there's lots of models out there for folks doing community oral history projects to sort of determine what should be negotiated with their participants. And I also, I think one of the things that's really hard to do, especially when you don't have a huge budget, but is really kind of critical, is to figure out where your oral history repository might live beyond the scope of the project. These are jewels, right? Every interview is a jewel, and it's a testament to the time and energy, not just of the participants, but to the people who organize the oral history project. And it's a window into and snapshot of a particular place in time. And it's important to think about, like, could it live in the local library? Could it live in a oral history collection that's online somewhere? Will these recordings outlive the technology that they were used, that was used to make them? Can the technology be sort of simplified in some way? Does it matter if it's live, or would a transcript maybe provide some of that kind of historical trace? What are the implications? And then I think the final thing I would want to say is that oral history can sometimes stir things up. It can get people excited. It can get people excited in good ways or bad ways. And I think that one of the commitments of any oral history project sort of should be some level of commitment to addressing some of the things that come up because of the project. Not in the context maybe of one interview, someone says they really think that a particular street should be named after their grandfather because of things that happened on that street. You're not gonna be able to do that. Or you probably aren't gonna be able to do that. But if you're collecting oral histories and something sort of seems to really resonate for a lot of people, or to keep sort of coming to the surface, it's worth thinking about how the project can see that, even if it doesn't really have anything to do with history making or research, but how the project and the project leaders can see that as a really important and critical next step, as a means of respecting and honoring the memory work that's been kind of committed in the name of the project. So yeah, I think those are kind of the things I went over in our original meeting, and I think that's enough for now. And conversation and questions and Lindy would be great.
Yeah, Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Margo. And Lindy, why don't you take it away and add to it? You've done so much oral history work yourself in this community. I think you can really add some wisdom.
Well,
to this.
it's interesting. Your point in terms of making it, having it happen and being in the middle of that discussion and watching the excitement of growing around the building of the energy park. And my head just went immediately to, okay, how do we plug into this energy to do this thing that we're doing right here while we're doing this? And then of course I've built this whole project in my head, and of who to interview and who are the people in Greenfield who are the next Sandy Thomases. Who are the people who have that energy and that charisma and that whatever, who are going to go on and take things, and what are they doing now, and what's happening that we don't know. There's a lot happening in this town that we have no idea is happening, and who's doing it and what is it. So oral history begets that next action step that you're talking about. And I think the best example of that in terms of personal examples is the literacy project stuff. And clearly from the very beginning, oral history was part of my curriculum in terms of how I taught reading and writing. Most of what I was doing was a language experience, it would be called, or other things, but what it was oral history. It was asking people to tell their stories and learn how to read their own stories. And then years later, after I was no longer the director, I guess it was about 12 years into the project, 13 years, they got a grant to do an actual oral history project with staff and students and volunteers. So it was this great project where they interviewed like 40 people that, were one of those three categories about their relationship with the literacy project. And it's fascinating. And what happened, now we have this result, we have this book. And then Margaret Anderson took the interviews and sort of, made them into easily readable pages or a couple pages. We do have all the transcriptions, but we also have this book of analysis or small synthesis. And then it became really clear it was a play. And that, a play like Vagina Monologues. I mean, it was, that kind of thing. And one of the faculty at the Literacy Project took it with 8 other students and faculty members, and they created this way too long, overbearing play that my mother sat through, and at the end said, "This is great, cut it in half," but it does tell the story of the making of a literacy program in a rural town in the middle of Massachusetts or New England, and what brought those people, what made them not learn to read and write in the first place. And it's so easy to to sort of name 1 or 2 ideas about what the cause was, but then after listening to all these people's voices, you realize it's a really complex thing, and it's all about trauma, and it's all about an agricultural world that stopped being an agricultural world, and there are many little tributaries that go through it. So I think that's my version. I introduced in the very beginning the oral history of my great uncle Lou Boucher, to give the idea that here's this thing that happened in my life as a 7-8-year-old, which clearly impacted the rest of my professional life, of collecting this oral history and hearing people's voices and hearing his voice. Anyway, so oral I love listening to people's stories. I mean, that's part of my attraction to the whole thing, is the attraction to history, but is also just the attraction. I love listening to people's stories, and I like trying to think about how to put them together in some sort of meaningful way that allows others access to them. And so that's why I think it's an important tool in this specific group of trainings that ECHO is doing. It's an important tool for people to have in their tool chest, to collect those. Anyway, I also, just in terms of, in relation to Margo, I love listening to your stories. I mean, so that was, and then your stories built more stories in me. And it's that same thing. It's that building of the excitement of the processes, you know. So I'm sorry, you know, we lost the original because we don't have that anymore. But yeah, I'm hoping to continue to do things that allows you and I to create energy, and hopefully people will take that same energy and go off and do interesting things with it.
You know, Lindy, I'm glad you mentioned the progression from doing the oral histories to, you know, the book to the play, because that also ties into one of the things that we're focusing on in ECHO Greenfield, which is that you can express what you know about history and what you've learned in creative ways, like presenting plays or paintings or dances or whatever. So ties in.
When I was thinking about this, I went back to look at what materials I shared with that day. And I realized that I only shared that, and then the literacy project booklet. And then it was the day that we did, you know, how are the ways that we can show, you know, make them accessible, that I brought in all the books of people, you know, all the creative ways people had shared their stuff with.
Right.
So yeah, it's sort of the next step to this conversation is creative ways to express your histories.
So I would just invite each of us, if we have any other comments or questions for either Lindy or Margo, to chime in at this point. And
well, I have a few questions, and I think they're for both of you.
Okay.
So there are 3 or 4 interrelated questions I have for the two of you. One is, when we are relying on that subjective memory that we all have, that evolves or devolves or evolves, I don't know what the right term is, how do we detect BS? I mean, we each see the world as we want to see it, maybe, and sometimes we intentionally mislead, and we've seen so much of that in recent years, and so much of, given the speed of which we communicate or miscommunicate, it's pretty hard to bring critical thinking to it, because we don't sit in rooms for hours and hear stories and question. We have things thrown at us, and then the next things are thrown at us. And so thinking about how can we support both honoring the oral history process, but also making sure that we have an effective toolkit of BS detectors, and ways of questioning what we're hearing in a respectful way, but a way that helps us to sort of sort through what we're hearing. So let me start with that one, and for either or both of you.
I can start. I think that BS detection really needs to happen everywhere around the interview, but I do not think that it needs to happen within the context of the interview. I think that whom we choose to interview may sort of raise these questions around how they might be using the interview to posture. I think when people are grandiose, or when people misrepresent the past, there are lots of reasons for it. But I think that this idea that maybe sometimes people will intentionally misrepresent is kind of an issue that should be caught when we're considering whom to interview. And I also think that no interview as a single source should ever be indicative of the full story. There is no single story, and a single story, as we've all learned, is deeply dangerous. But what I do want to say is that sometimes people misremember, and sometimes people highlight a particular version in a way that may seem like BS to me, but in fact, they may be remembering what they wish they had said. They may be remembering something out of proportion to the way it might have been experienced, but they have added kind of significance to it because it has impacted and affected them in the intervening time between the event and the interview. And so what I always tell my students is that just like Emily Dickinson told us that poetry tells the truth but tells it slant, I tell them that oral history and memory tell the truth but tell it slant. And there are a lot of ethics and a lot of questions around our relationship with interpretation and presentation, especially when we're sort of holding it as history. But I guess my position is that unless it's really obvious that someone is willfully sort of trying to create a primary source to misrepresent themselves and or the history about which we're talking, I think it's more productive and kinder to engage with the way people are remembering in the context of the interview, and then to find other ways and other means to either corroborate that or to complicate that interpretation. I think so many people, so many people have been trivialized, and so many people have felt unimportant and trivialized. And there's a much fewer, I believe, proportion of people who have felt empowered and celebrated in the in narration of their life stories. And so I guess I run the risk. I make the choice to run the risk of being kind of duped, or maybe celebrating something that isn't at all true or shouldn't be celebrated, because I'm afraid that if I raise questions and challenge a participant in an oral history, that could really shut them down and also just reaffirm what they've always been told and taught, that their experience and their stories don't really matter. It's a really important question, and it's a sort of an incomplete answer, but I do think about that an awful lot. So, yeah.
I'm not sure that's an incomplete answer. I think it's right. Like, I think that when you're interviewing a population of people that's been traumatized and belittled and all those things for years, and then you say, you're important enough for us to come and interview you along with your other people, then you're offering them a stage. I mean, or you're offering them a place to finally say that story, and you have to listen. I mean, that's that commitment to having to both listen and speak. And I think the bullshit detector comes later. like maybe in use of how you're going to use the interview and the, you know, towards the end, but the during, it's their version. Yeah, and maybe you got to get more people telling the same story, so you get a variance of lenses to put together the truth. But you have to, if you're going to do it, then you got to give them the space to do it and hold
Yeah,
it.
I think it goes back to theater for me, is that's one way that you
It is theater.
textualize any story, is by juxtaposing it with multiple other stories,
Right.
and build a more complicated and nuanced sense of what the story might be through that process. And also in terms of our stated goals of the ECHO project, we are about uncovering the stories that have not had a chance to be told, have not been listened to before. When I think about the BS part of things, I think sort of on one level, the dominant narrative is full of it. And that's why Echo Greenfield is an important project. On another level, I remember what drove me crazy as a child, but I understand a little bit more now, was my mother's embellishments about, particularly when she talked about me and told the story that was on me. And she would always say, well, it makes a better story. And to understand that our brains love that our brains are all about making a better story. First, they're all about making a story. They're about taking raw experience and turning it into a narrative so that we can understand the world we live in and learn how to maneuver within it. So yeah, on some level, it's about understanding then that history is vulnerable to all the same things our brains are vulnerable to, which is wanting to grab the first thing that makes sense and cobble it into a story. And then if it's challenged enough, maybe change it. And it's only through looking at lots of those things that we begin to build a more inclusive and nuanced picture of reality, you know, if we can ever approach that.
I don't know if any of you guys have ever seen or read Brian Friel's play, Philadelphia, Here I Come. But in this story, there's a single son who has been raised by a widowed father, and he is taciturn and he is withholding of emotion. And the son has been given an opportunity to leave Ireland and move to Philadelphia. And he is torn because he is his father's kind of living connection and the only child. And he's not sure his dad loves him, but he has this memory of his dad taking him out in a blue boat with a sack of sandwiches. And it's this memory of a kind of a father and son's kind of shared moment of joy. And he keeps trying to ask if his father remembers it because he doesn't want to stay in Ireland for no reason, right? He only wants to stay if he kind of thinks he shares something with his dad, even though his dad is kind of, you know, not expressive. So he keeps saying, like, Dad, do you remember the blue boat? Do you remember the blue boat? And the dad keeps saying no. And this leads the son. He's just like, no, there's no blue boat. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't remember this at all. I don't remember the blue boat. And so the son ends up leaving. And the end of the film is the dad reflecting on his memory of the exact same event, except it was a red boat and there were no sandwiches, there were apples or something.
Mm.
And there is this like this deep sense of kind of a moment lost, an opportunity lost. And it's like, you know, the forensic truth, we don't know if it was a blue boat or a red boat, or there were sandwiches or there were apples. And we all know those are details, but in the context of the stories, they weren't the details, they were the kind of furniture around which the most heartfelt kind of personal experiences were built. And it always stuck with me, like, you know, to go back to Doug's point, is like, what are the things that people are getting wrong, right? Are they important? Like, are they central to this narrative, or are they just kind of the furniture around which the really important stuff is built? And I think that sort of ties back to both Jan's comments about theater and Lindy's comments about providing and offering people a space, and then honoring that space that you've provided, and kind of, you know, asking questions about it later.
You know, I can't help but remember one of our favorite family stories is about a car accident we were in. And this goes exactly to the blue boat or red boat question. We were rear-ended. Doug was driving. Our oldest son was in the car. Our other two kids were in the car. I was in the car. And shortly after the scene of the accident, nobody was hurt, by the way, and that's important to know. Doug said, "What color was the car that hit us?" And we had 5 different answers. 5 different answers. We had just been hit by a car, and they ranged in accuracy from Doug's memory to Noah's, because he was a car mechanic, so he noticed things about cars, to the rest of us who were wildly off. And then we got the police report, which confirmed for us that we were hit by a moron colored car. So where in there is the truth? I mean, the importance was we shared an accident and we were all okay, you know, and
Right.
not the color of the car.
Well, I want to push a tiny bit further on this point, but not, you know, not real far, but I think there's a honoring the person you're speaking with, and that's crucial. And I think one of the things that came through for both Margo and Lindy was a clear love and appreciation for hearing the stories, of valuing the stories and making sure people feel valued when they're heard. That's one piece of it. And another is having the stories help us understand the world around us.
Right, the use of it.
And so I think about, for example, stories about racism through the years that have been passed down by family members to family members, that perpetuated racism, and saying, okay, I can value what I'm hearing from you, that it's your story and your understanding of the world, but it's clearly incomplete. So that process of how do I go beyond the story I'm hearing while honoring what I'm hearing from somebody as their story and their way of making meaning, to recognize that that's not the whole picture, which relates to another question I have, which is how do we go about locating the voices we're not hearing? I mean, some of what is coming through, and part of what we're about with the Echo, is recognizing that official stories or stories that are told and told often exclude voices that would help us to understand more. What is the process? How can we go about, and this is a real present day question, how do we locate people who have stories that need to be heard? How do we go about doing that? And how do we go about doing that in ways that they will trust that we really want to hear their stories and value what they have to say, when that's not necessarily been their experience in the past?
Right. I think I've started that process, Doug. I took a lot of the names that Sandy talked about in terms of people who were movers and shakers, and I want to ask them who they think the unheard movers and shakers are within their communities, and then go and interview them about things they're doing now, not necessarily about the energy park, but about what are you doing? What do you know? Or if the person who refers me to them gives me an example, like this person's doing this incredible stuff at the farm at Greenfield Gardens and is very active in getting people involved and blah, 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 then I can use that as a context place for the interview. But it's like folding another fold and looking under it and seeing what's under the next level of ground. to see where those voices are that you and I haven't heard yet.
And, I'm reminded by what Margo was saying early on in this conversation about how the same questions can elicit vastly different answers depending on depending on the people and the quality of their listening. And so I wonder, maybe just to kind of wrap up this conversation, Margo, if we could revisit that and ask you to just say a little bit about what is that difference that you saw, that how do we best listen to invite the fullest answers in ways that are not just, what's the body language, what's the active listening way that we communicate that evokes the best possible story from the person we're listening to.
Yeah, I think that's important. I think that an interview should take place in a space where the person who's been requested to share their story is comfortable. Sometimes that has been a public space in my experience. Sometimes it has been their home. The person who's being interviewed should have the option, if they would like another family member there with them. Sometimes that makes it a little bit complicated for the interview and the interviewee or the interviewer. But it's kind of an opportunity. It's really nice to get to know the person just a little bit before the interview if you don't know them. I find that sort of having a brief meeting and saying, this is kind of what it's going to look like, and you can stop the recording anytime you want to ask questions or to say, let's start that again. Before you actually appear with your recording equipment is often really useful, particularly for people who have not had a lot of experience of being kind of talking and being listened to in a setting that is not private, right? And an oral history interview is not private. It is asking someone to share their voice and their story beyond the sort of insular realm of the individual, the family, and possibly a little bit broader than that. But a lot of people don't have that experience. They're not used to having the mic, and so I think that's really important. I think that the reason I sort of, I understand what Doug is saying, and I want to get back to that in a second. But I find that there's sometimes some dissonance between listening and there's different brain operating functions at work between the act of listening and the act of fact checking. And anybody who has ever had a fight with a spouse knows exactly, or someone they love very deeply knows exactly kind of what that dissonance feels like. You're trying to solve a problem and listen to each other's perspectives, but then you're like, no, that's not what happens. And it's really hard to move beyond that, as opposed to that act of listening to someone else's perspective and processing that, and maybe trying to figure out a kind of version of the truth that you both can live with, but not maybe when those emotions are really tender and a little bit raw. So the act of listening is a full act. It's an act with your body. It's an act with your eyes. It's an act with your, not stillness, but trying not to fidget, trying to be really wholly present. It's a skill. Sometimes interviewers that are new to the process want to interject with their own experiences. It's really common. My students do that all the time. They start talking about themselves in the interviews. It's really natural, and it's human, right? We like to make connections. So some of that's great. This isn't a therapy session, right? The oral history interviewer is not a therapist. But trying to sort of keep the focus on the person being interviewed is a good rule of thumb. I think, like, I often think about W.E.B. Du Bois, who said that we take on the ideas that other people have of us. And if we only know ourselves through the eyes of others, then that really shapes the stories that we tell, depending on how people know us. So people who have been privileged sort of know themselves as privileged, and maybe in their own experience just blot out the things that complicate that, or aren't even really aware that things that seem very normal to them are in fact not really normative experiences for the vast majority of us. And I'm a big believer in the silences and the things that aren't said. And I think that it's one thing when you're sort of pursuing scholarship. I worked on a project about the KKK in Athol, and a lot of people were like, the descendants of KKK members in Athol are still in Athol, and so we can collect this history, but we can't publish it anywhere. And I find that's really it's really interesting, and it's really real. What are the consequences of the stories we tell in public is a question that needs to be asked with every project. And we may not always, we might want to sort of put everything out there, but I think it's tricky. That's all I can really say, is I think it's tricky. And I think that these are really important questions and really important issues that we always need to keep talking about. And I think the more that you have a kind of concrete example, then the richer and more productive those conversations can be. I think that once we kind of are in this like really generalized realm, it can end up being kind of cyclical.
Well, unless anybody else has something that just feels like it's got to be said right now, we're almost at the hour mark, so I would think this is a good time to thank Margo and Lindy for recreating to some degree, and giving us another angle in other ways. I'm so glad I got to hear the story again, Margo, of the cab driver. And how that really works. And I share your consternation about the displacement of cab drivers as a profession. And looking forward to hearing what you discover, Lindy, with your interviewing the people who are mentioned by the people who are mentioned. In that layer of the stories. So we will then leave it here today, and wherever you are as you're hearing this, if you're hearing it on the website, keep checking our website, and there's more programming being added all the time. So thank you for watching.
Thanks.
Thank you both.
Thanks, everybody. Take good care.
You too.